Well, good afternoon to this standing room only crowd here in Ottawa. My name is Khalil Sharif. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada. And on behalf of AKFC and the ONE Campaign, it is an absolute delight to welcome you here at the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate in Ottawa. For those of you who are here with us in person and those of you who are joining online, you should know that we are here on the traditional land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, who for centuries, maybe even millennia, here at the point where the three rivers meet, were responsible for bringing together, in a spirit of hospitality, a very large number of Indigenous people from a catchment area across this part of Canada. And they brought those people here. They were hospitable in the spirit of exchange. Certainly exchange of goods and services, but also of ideas and of relationships. And it is a great privilege for all of us who have come after to be able to sustain and be inspired by and contribute in some small way to that great tradition of hospitality and gathering that we've learned from the Indigenous people of this land, and it's a great privilege to be able to do that today. This building, which is just commemorated its 15th anniversary, was also conceived in that same spirit of bringing people together to lift our collective horizons for how Canada might contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous and pluralist world, which brings us to the discussion we are having today on unlocking development finance. I want to welcome a number of special guests here from the diplomatic community. We have the Acting High Commissioner of Uganda and the Ambassador from Mali, as well as the Ambassador, I think, from Bulgaria, who's joining us online, and the Assistant Deputy Minister for Africa from Global Affairs Canada, Cheryl Urban, who I'll introduce in just a second, and many other members of the diplomatic corps, leaders of civil society, the academy, and government. It's a delight to have you all here. This issue that we're going to be talking about today is obviously critical. The requirements, the opportunities, the needs, and the responsibilities for financing the improvement in sustainable quality of life for humanity across the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, maybe even here at home, is one of the principal challenges that we face today. The confluence of a massively changing economy that is creating uncertainty with respect to people's economic development paths, and a climate crisis that is now upon us, means that the paths to a more sustainable future are actually not so clear. And it is inaugurating, therefore, a period that calls for a great deal of innovation and experimentation, which is why we are very happy to have brought this session together. Now, every one of the extraordinary speakers you're going to hear today could be on stage themselves to speak for an hour. We're going to give you a buffet taste across many sets of ideas. The goal being to explore the dimensionality, all the rich possibilities associated with these issues, and to hopefully whet your appetite for even more. And to get us going, I'm delighted to have with us Cheryl Urban, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Sub-Saharan Africa from Global Affairs Canada. Many of you will know Cheryl. She's been with Global Affairs Canada for 15 years in a number of areas. Just before this assignment, she was the Director General for Economic Development, so it really speaks to her specific qualifications to be with us today. I know Cheryl because, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we worked together on the Afghanistan Task Force when that was such a centerpiece of the Canadian Development Program. So Cheryl brings a very, very long history and track record on these important issues and is at the center of it today. So we're delighted to have Cheryl amongst us. Let me hand it over to Cheryl for some welcome remarks. Cheryl.
Good afternoon, bon après-midi. Thank you, Khalil, for that warm introduction, and thank you to the Aga Khan Foundation for hosting this important event and for asking me to speak. So yes, I am the Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for Sub-Saharan Africa at Global Affairs Canada. And so that means that I'm responsible for advancing Canada's interests in Africa and also leading our engagement with African countries and institutions in this very important region of the world. Whether it is the Sustainable Development Goals, climate finance, or even debt relief, mobilizing finance is critical for many African countries for their security and for their prosperity. And that is why mobilization is a central tenet of Canada's engagement with African countries and institutions. Understanding the opportunities and the impediments to enhancing trade and investment, reforming multilateral institutions and mechanisms, and strategically using our international assistance are fundamental priorities for Canada and for our African partners. J'ai eu l'occasion au début de mon nouveau mandat, pendant cet été, je me rends à 2 reprises sur le continent. Au cours de ces visites, j'ai appris comment les pays et les institutions africaines utilisent l'aide au développement pour progresser vers la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable. Le travail du Canada dans le cadre de la politique d'aide internationale féministe a un impact réel et positif, et les initiatives en matière de santé, d'éducation, d'égalité entre les genres ouvrent la voie. With the Feminist International Assistance Policy, we are really paving the way, especially when it comes to interventions in health, education, and gender equality. So I mentioned that I had traveled since I started in the summer twice with our ministers to the African continent in my current role. I went to Kenya with Minister Hussein and we attended the Africa Climate Summit. And it was quite a remarkable event, I have to say. The energy there was palpable. It's really clear from attending that African countries and institutions are increasingly organized and are very clearly articulating their perspectives on this global challenge. And also they're emphasizing that this has a disproportionate impact on African countries, but also that mobilizing finance for climate mitigation and adaptation is critical. And this was in everybody's speeches that were speaking at that summit. I also traveled to Zambia and to Ghana. And when I was there, I had the opportunity to speak to government officials about their perspectives on other issues, including the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment. And we talked about how important these processes are, but also how challenging they have been, and how we have to take a look at that. When I was in Ghana, I really was grateful for the opportunity to speak to an official from the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. That was an opportunity for me to hear firsthand about the promises of this agreement, how that can help with inter-African trade, and also an opportunity for me to explore the benefits of some of the support that Canada has provided for this work in the development of the Secretariat, and also now about the implementation of this potentially game-changing agreement. Throughout these visits, and also when I'm here in Canada and I'm engaging with African partners, I always hear the same message, which is that Canada needs to deepen and broaden its engagement with African countries and African institutions. And this has to be relationships that are founded on our shared interests about increased prosperity and security, and also one that increasingly prioritizes unlocking financial opportunities. And that's why I think that opportunities like today, where we will exchange, are very, very critical. Blended finance and multilateral development bank reform are essential components of any mobilization strategy for Africa. With blended finance, we have a playbook of how to get public and private sector funds working together for greater impact. But we are having global challenges with mobilizing significant private sector capital into this space. There are multiple impediments, but there are also many known solutions that need to be adapted to local conditions. On reforms, Canada has benefited from 75 years of the rules-based international order, with significant reforms underway within the United Nations, the international financial institutions, the World Trade Organization. African countries are not only a part of the chorus that are demanding these reforms, but they will be fundamentally influencing the direction of those reforms. And it's very important for countries, including Canada, to have deep and meaningful engagement with their African counterparts and with African institutions to talk through our shared interests and do this bilaterally and also through multilateral fora. Finally, the mobilization of finance into Africa is a global priority. Canada is working in the context of the G7 and the G20 with our colleagues on these issues. We're all collectively facing fiscal challenges, but this just further heightens the demand for collaborative and efficient approaches. Ici, au Canada, nous nous efforçons au mieux aligner pour un plus grand effet tout ce que nous avons à offrir. Même si nous devons continuer à travailler de manière multilatérale dans ces domaines, des discussions comme celle aujourd'hui nous aident à mieux articuler une approche plus robuste pour l'ensemble des engagements du Canada et pas seulement limitée à ceux du gouvernement. And what a great lineup of speakers. I'm really excited. I'm here to learn and to listen to those ideas. I really like the idea of a buffet of innovative ideas. So I really feel that I will benefit from hearing those ideas. And I thank you for the invitation, and I wish everybody a good session. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. I want to thank you for being here, and also Global Affairs Canada, which is a partner of ours in convening here on a regular basis, for which we are extremely grateful. And of course, to the ONE Campaign again for this very entrepreneurial and energetic partnership they have created with us to put this on. Okay, on to the program. I'm delighted that we will have moderating our session today, Adrian Harewood. He really needs no introduction, I think, to this city. One of our most prominent journalists here in Ottawa, was the very beloved host of the Ottawa News at 6 on CBC TV, and before that on the Drive Home show. We all know Adrian's voice and his extraordinary journalistic work. He is now a professor at Carleton School of Journalism and Communications, where he is teaching this all to the next generation and telling us what the future of journalism will look like. Adrian, thank you for being with us today and for taking us through today's program. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Khalil, for that very, very generous introduction. I don't get that kind of affirmation at home. You know, I should come to the Aga Khan Foundation more often. This is the kind of love that I need in my life. But thank you, and welcome to all of you. It's great to see you. As we speak, the welfare of billions is in the balance. Human beings are facing a series of catastrophic global crises: climate change, ecosystem degradation, resource depletion, devastating armed conflicts. At this moment, 600 million people are living in extreme poverty. In the midst of these challenges are opportunities, though, for transformation, are possibilities to create the world anew. What role can development finance play in creating the change that millions would like to see in their lives? How can we mobilize capital to unlock the ingenuity, innovation, and green potential of Africa? What role can multilateral development banks play in supporting the policy reforms that are needed to meet the needs of people around the world? How to build a future that is resilient, sustainable, and inclusive? How can African agency and sovereignty be supported in its development and transition to a green future? Today, we want to have a conversation about opportunity, a conversation about possibility, a conversation about how to generate potentially trillions of dollars in low-cost capital to unlock Africa's green potential and allow millions of people to realize their full human potential. We have assembled a stellar panel of experts to discuss how to unlock finance at the global level. Nancy Lee came in from DC today. Nancy is the Director of Sustainable Development Finance and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. She's also a Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her work at CGD focuses on the role and performance of multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, mobilizing private development finance, blended finance, that's a term we're going to be talking about this afternoon, sovereign debt restructuring architecture, public-private infrastructure finance, and gender lens investing. Nancy, welcome, please, come on. Stanley Achonu deserves an award, and he deserves an award because he came in from Abuja today, and it was a long flight. It's been a long 24 hours. Stanley has over 10 years of experience in the management of development programs and policy reform in civil society and government. He served as the civil society advisor at the Nigeria Open Government Partnership, OGP, Secretariat, where he coordinated Nigeria's membership of the OGP and the implementation of Nigeria's reform commitments. Stanley, welcome. And James Wangi is joining us virtually this afternoon. James is the founder of Climate Action Platform for Africa, which he launched alongside Carlin Nguyen in 2021 to help unlock Africa's potential to transform its economies while playing a leading role in effective climate action. Prior to that, he spent 20 years at the Dahlberg Group, which he helped found, leading the firm's expansion into Africa in 2007, serving as global managing partner of Dahlberg Advisors, and most recently was the executive director of the Dahlberg Group. James, a very warm welcome from a very cold nation's capital in Ottawa. James, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian.
James, can you hear me? Are you there?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Wonderful, wonderful. James, I think I'm going to begin with you because I know that you have been asserting that there are three crucial challenges that African countries face. First, climate change. Second, a massive youth population. And third, the need to develop and grow. And you suggest that each is also an opportunity that converges with the others. Can you help us frame the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon around Africa's opportunities and challenges when it comes to development and the green transition?
Sure, Adrian. I'll try and do it very quickly. And in doing so, I'll resort to one of those tired rhetorical techniques, the rule of three. So you outline three challenges to address. I'll outline three aspects that Africa brings to the table, and then I'll zero them in on a particular opportunity, which also has three elements. And those three aspects that Africa has are, again, that young labor force. We talk about them as a challenge in terms of getting them into work and so on. But it's really true that the world's workforce of the century is largely African. It's also true that Africa is richly endowed in natural resources. Those manifest in the poverty of its economy, in the fact that it currently exports those resources largely unprocessed and adds very little value to its exports, while they import almost all its finished goods. That's a formula for structural poverty. But it also means that there's resources and land and so on in abundance. And finally, perhaps a special kind of resource. You know, while we think of Africa as the home of energy poverty in many ways, in terms of how we talk about the continent, it is also almost obscenely endowed with untapped renewable energy potential. Renewable energy potential that will be absolutely crucial to averting climate catastrophe. And it helps to really zero in on that climate catastrophe because, in a way, the climate crisis is what gives structure to it has to really stand as almost the prime imperative for humanity in this century. And the IPCC and the Paris Agreement, all of that is very clear that if we are to see at 22nd century as a species, humanity will need to do three things as a hitherto unimagined. The first is we will need to protect and indeed expand our natural carbon sinks, our rainforests, our grasslands, our mangroves, and so on. We need to protect and expand what little we have left, recognizing that those take decades, if not centuries, to regenerate. The second thing we need to do is we need to massively cut global emissions. Really kind of going off a cliff. It's probably the fastest single transition, industrial transition in human history. Not probably, it definitely is, in terms of moving away from a carbon-intensive economy globally in every aspect of consumption and production. It's not just about getting rid of your gas-guzzling car. It's about changing what you wear. It's about changing how you produce your food. It's about changing how you construct your home to remove the embedded emissions in every aspect of human life. And the third thing we need to do is we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere at, frankly, mind-boggling, in mind-boggling points. This is different from protecting nature, because nature on its own will not do it. And you take those three things together and they create a formula and an opportunity for Africa to deploy its three assets against these three challenges and realize climate positive growth. And I'm hearing that my headphones might be an issue. Let me just try. Continue, and you let me know if the reception is better.
I think that's better, actually, James.
Yeah, so this creates this opportunity for something I'm calling climate positive growth. And it's the idea that it's recognizing an underlying reality. The world is not on track to hit these three massive imperatives for its survival unless Africa plays a huge role. And it just so happens that investing in Africa across those three dimensions, conserving nature, removing carbon from all our value chains and value streams, and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, all of that translates into huge amounts of capital to go into unlocking opportunity and creating jobs on the continent in everything from stewarding of nature, climate smart agriculture, green manufacturing, and carbon removal at scale. These can sound like buzzwords and things that are out there, but the reality is there's just no other way to do them at scale than to do them in Africa. And frankly, there's very few other economic transformations of a scale big enough to get those 2.5 billion people by 2050 out of poverty and into the core of the productive workforce of the planet, other than putting them to work against our biggest single challenge. So that ties into the world of finance in a range of different ways, but I do want to ground us in the sense that talking about finance without talking about what you're financing, or talking about investment without talking about what the return is, always ends in an incomplete discussion. In a sense, the point is Africa offers the biggest prize the world has ever had, which is basically another century and beyond, if it can be mobilized in the right way, and if Africa itself can get to work, not just talking about the challenge that climate change poses, but the ways in which tapping Africa's unique resources allows us to make faster progress against our climate goals than almost any other lever that's out there.
Okay, thank you, James. I think James has laid down the gauntlet, and he's presented the challenge, the rather daunting challenge that the world faces, that Africa faces, but also has presented many opportunities for transformation. So it's clear that the challenges and the opportunities are huge, and so are the financing needs to achieve this potential. And Nancy, I want to direct this question at you, because one question that arises is, what is the responsibility of wealthy countries like Canada to assist Africa in this transition? You've been following closely one of the biggest topics of discussion that have come up in global forums like the G20, and also at World Bank annual meetings, and that is, the need for major reforms to multilateral development banks, or MDBs, like the World Bank or the African Development Bank. So can you give us an overview of the recommendations that have come up through this process, and also address the role of wealthy countries like Canada?
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you asked me that question, because I want to start actually with the statement that Canada has really always punched above its weight in the multilateral system. And I say that as an American, having engaged with Canadian counterparts and the finance minister in global affairs for many years, inside government and now outside government. It punches above its weight partly because of its financial contributions to the system, but also because of the quality of its ideas, the credibility of the analysis underpinning those ideas, and a certain kind of principled approach to policy. So I realized that if I were Canadian, I couldn't sit up here and say that because Canadians are, inherently self-deprecating. But I wanted to start with that as an objective observer and colleague of Canadians in various enterprises. So I want to add to James's three with three more features of the current environment that have really changed the landscape, particularly for poor and vulnerable countries. The first is indebtedness. I won't go into it in detail. You all know the statistics. I'm just going to give you a couple. One is that 24 African countries are either in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. The other is that the ratio of debt service to revenues has increased by 2.5 times for poor countries. So an extremely large share of their revenues are being absorbed in just paying debt service rather than health and education and other kinds of investments. And two other quick points. One is that 30 or 40% of that debt is owed to the private sector, not just to multilateral development banks, which means they're much more sensitive to interest rates, changes on the global environment. And finally, just to add to the challenges, as we talk about opportunities and challenges, a lot of that debt has to be rolled over in 2024 and 2025. So it's not just a question of debt service, it is a question of actually refinancing that debt and paying back the principal if that debt can't be refinanced. So that has huge implications for the multilateral development banks. Second is a lot of the performance of African and poor income economies is now influenced by decisions taken outside their economies. Decisions on climate, we saw decisions on health during the pandemic, conflict decisions, and this vulnerability to changes in interest rates. So the MDBs have always been very good at telling countries what to do in their own economies. They need to start being better at helping countries act collectively to address common problems, particularly for countries that are very vulnerable to the impact of those
Nancy, just for those people who might not be familiar with the language of MDBs, can you just explain what are multilateral development banks?
So multilateral development banks are publicly owned banks that are capitalized and that leverage their capital for the purpose of supporting development. The global multilateral development bank is the World Bank, and then there are regional development banks in all parts of the world, including the African Development Bank. Their shareholders are all public. Their boards are all representatives of governments. Canada is a shareholder of these institutions, and as I say, has a particularly strong voice in those institutions. So what is the, and then one other feature which I think is worth noting, and Cheryl touched on this in the feminist assistance strategy, is that a lot of development now is dependent on kind of cross-cutting issues like climate, but also like gender. So if you're trying to just influence what happens in an individual sector like health or education, you might want to increase the size of what are called vertical funds, things like PEPFAR, Gavi, the Global Fund, which are focused on health, have a very clear mandate. But if you're trying to pursue these cross-cutting issues that really have to be integrated across sectors, MDBs are the best institutions we have for that. So that brings us to the agenda. Let me give you, I've just been involved in 2 very large reports on the agenda. I encourage you to read them. there are 3 volumes, and for some people, they're very interesting, but I'll give you the 2-minute version. The first report was whether there's enough capital in these institutions for the volume of lending that needs to be mobilized. And the answer is the current capital could support much more lending. It could be leveraged more if capital is used more efficiently in the institutions. And the report found that hundreds of billions of dollars of additional lending by the multilateral development banks is possible while maintaining the AAA ratings of these institutions. So that was a big kind of advance in the thinking of shareholders. Canada has been a big supporter of that agenda, and that is being pursued, although not vigorously enough, which I'll come back to. Second, there was a big report on whether the institutions need to be increased, the size of the institutions, and whether the institutions have to change their operational and business models. And that was something called the Independent Experts Group report. It was co-chaired by Larry Summers and N.K. Singh of India. The Indian, in their presidency of the G20, mandated that report. And that report, in a nutshell, proposed a large increase in the size of the system, with partly through capital increases, partly through better capital efficiency, but it also proposed very significant changes in the way the institutions operate. And so very quickly, those changes can be summarized as changes in the way the institutions deal with their country clients, changes in the way they deal with the private sector, and changes in the way they deal with each other. And so these changes are quite different from the way they operate. This would be operating with countries where the country sets the priorities, and all of the MDBs collaborate around those priorities, which you might think happens now. It does not. Number 2, for the private sector, a much different approach to mobilizing private capital, to do it at scale rather than transaction by transaction, and to bring the kind of government-facing and private sector-facing tools of these institutions together so that they can achieve that scale. And then finally, having the institutions collaborate as a system, having joint projects, common standards, common output and outcome measures, which again, you might expect happens. It does not. So just 2 quick points. We're seeing some innovation in response to this agenda. Canada, for example, has come forward in support of a new kind of investment in these institutions called hybrid capital. But we're not seeing these fundamental changes in the models, in the way they engage with the private sector, and in the way they engage with each other that really could make a difference in terms of stepping up both their own finance and the finance that they mobilize from the private sector. If let's say 2 things that Canada could do right at for this particular year, the most important decision that any donor government faces this year is how much money it is willing to contribute to IDA, which is the window for the poorest countries in the World Bank Group, financing at very concessional terms. So this is a difficult finance decision, it's a difficult fiscal situation, but it is by far the most important decision any government will make in terms of allowing poor countries access to more finance. And then I would say Canada needs to continue the strong voice it already is exerting in the G20. So it's not just a question of making the institutions better, but it's making the institutions more effective.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And just before you get to Sandy, very quickly, IDA is International Development Assistance.
Yes, it's
Right.
it's not a great name, but it's basically there are 2. Well, there are actually 4 windows in the World Bank. There's one in their normal lending to middle-income countries. There is one for the poorest countries, and that's called IDA.
Yeah.
And its financing terms are much more beneficial. And then there's one for lending to the private sector. And then there's one particular one that does insurance, which is also underutilized.
Okay,
That's
thank you,
another
Nancy. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Stanley, you have an incredible amount of experience, of course, working in Nigeria, across many countries in Africa. We know that the youth population across the continent is exploding. It's a huge population. What do you see as being the priorities for youth on the continent at this moment?
Thank you again. Glad to be back here in Ottawa. It's been 4 years. In terms of what the expectations are, I think jobs ranks one at the top of the list for the population in Africa. James did allude to those opportunities, especially in the green job sector. That is one big priority for the population in Africa, just opportunity to contribute their quota to development, to catering, through lifting themselves out of poverty. Just give them job opportunities. But we know the challenge with creating jobs is not because the areas where the jobs should be created are unknown, or where the opportunities lie. It comes down to what we have discussed so far today, which is you need to finance it to create jobs. You need a lot of money to create those opportunities, even if you're doing green jobs, you're building factories, you're financing infrastructure. You need a lot of money, which the African countries sadly do not have. For some reason, for several reasons, but one, because of the uneven financial, global financial architecture, which is what we have been talking about. I must commend Canada's role in sort of giving Africa agency. Canada went all out to back Africa Union seats on the G20, G21 as it is now. But there is more to be done in driving sort of the kind of reforms in MDBs, where Africa is then able to access cheaper financing for these kind of opportunities that young people expect on the continent. We have done a recent report at ONE looking at interest rates and how it directly impacts Africa. It's you all can relate to this when you talk about your mortgage, right? Interest rate directly affects your mortgage. And some people wonder, what has that got to do with what goes on in far-flung Nigeria, thousands of kilometers from here? It has direct impact as you're struggling with mortgage financing and all of that. It has direct impact on Africa as interest rate changes here in America, in Canada, and the rest of the global capital. It has direct impact on government finances on the continent, because a lot of that financing has come from private sector. And as interest rate changes, it moves along with how much they're able to pay. In a recent report by ONE, when African governments borrow from the capital market, they spend far more in interest repayment than they would when they borrow from the World Bank, and which is why the reform that is being called for has bigger impact than it's not some artificial, we need to make changes kind of approach. It is real life impacting kind of demand that we're making. If you reform the World Bank, low-income countries, as she mentioned, a lot of them on the African continent, we then borrow at lower costs and be able to meet their needs and avoid huge interest rates. But one of the other things that is unsaid about MDB reforms is also timelines. Recently, Zambia spent 2 years trying to get through bankruptcy, basically. Here, you can't spend 2 years. If you're bankrupt, the process is very quick, right? Response is very quick. But for a country to spend 2 years trying to get refinancing through World Bank tells you how difficult the process is, not just in terms of being able to access the money, but the process of accessing the money when it is put on the table. Everybody agrees we need to make the financing available, but it takes 2 years to get through the process. So the reform is not just about making more capital available, but it's also about changing the processes to be more responsive to the needs. And she did sort of allude to, letting those who are impacted be part of the decision making in terms of how you invest, right? But one other challenge, and this is something that we need to talk about, you brought it up a little while ago, is how countries are now investing in these multilateral institutions. She has clearly outlined how important this process is. But we have also seen in the last 10 years, drastic reduction in contributions to IDAs, to replenishment of the World Bank and all of the rest, clearly through ODA budget cuts. UK has led the process of budget cuts. Germany has just done that. We expect this to continue to go around the world. And a lot of it driven by local politics and the need to respond to internal happenings. And I'm sure there's a conversation to be had about that. I don't want to get into the Canada sort of situation. But I want to make the point that while we try to respond to local needs and win votes, and this is to politicians, while we try to win votes, and all of that, we should recognize that the world is so interconnected that by stepping back from multilateral institutions and global partnerships like, reforming the World Bank and putting more money to make it accessible for development, we're not protecting ourselves, we're opening ourselves to risk. COVID clearly showed that the world is so interconnected that something that happens in China can shut the entire world down. So, and Africa holds, sort of that bright future for us to sort of show how we can reorder the world, make changes, invest in opportunities for young people, make financing available, drive development. And I think that is at the heart of how we should view the process of replenishment of IDA and all the rest of these global institutions as well.
Yeah. Stanley, I'm not sure if James is still with us, but I did want to pose a question to you and James, because you alluded to the fact that Canada has played a positive role in pushing for Africa to have a place at the G20, the now G21. But how else can Canada and countries like Canada be supportive, authentic partners with Africa? What are some concrete things that Canada can do to demonstrate that?
I think that Canada's approach, obviously leading to results, but has been a little laid back.
Too laid back.
A little laid back, not too
What
laid back.
What does that mean?
So for instance, others have been, well, I guess everybody with their own approach. A few other countries have been very sort of frontal about their partnership with Africa and sort of laying out in clear terms, maybe sometimes it's just rhetoric, but, you could see, for some other countries, they are very clear in terms of their strategy for Africa. I know that Canada is, a lot of conversation around Canada-Africa strategy, but it has to be, there has to be some speed and agency to that process. And we're hoping that, when Canada finally puts together an Africa strategy, it has to be ambitious. We have seen, what Canada has done with the Indo-Pacific, and seeing where where they have put their mouths in the last few years, clearly recognize that Africa plays an important role. I think my concern would be speed and agency in which they have done it. I think it can be faster, it can be quicker. They can also be more vocal. They speak up for Africa at the right places, but they also have to sort of become more sort of vocal about their support for Africa. I guess to encourage others to also take it seriously, as Canada does.
Nancy, I don't think James is there, so I'm going to go to you. Like, would you concur with what Stanley said there? Has Canada been too laid back when it comes to?
Well,
engaging?
I would say I would not single out Canada in this regard. I would say that the G7 countries generally, which have traditionally been the donors and have traditionally controlled the terms of debt restructurings, as you were alluding to, haven't really found a way, they really haven't found a way at this point to make the debt restructuring process faster. And they also haven't found a way to help countries before they default, so they don't have to go through this whole default process. They tried suspending debt service during the pandemic, but that actually didn't work very well. So I would say this whole debt problem has exploded And the G7 really hasn't found a way to address it. But I just wanted to add one other thing that Canadians can do, and I'm talking now about Canadian private investors. Much of the money for climate finance does not go to emerging markets generally, but it certainly doesn't go to frontier markets. We're still seeing all of that climate finance that flows across borders go almost all to high-income countries. So I think it is incumbent on big institutional investors in Canada, pension funds, insurance funds, to start finding ways to channel some of that investment to take advantage of these opportunities that James was just talking about. Okay. And they can do so if they really put a lot of pressure on the multilateral development banks to give them the data that those banks have on credit performance in those kinds of markets. Because what's happening now is they think the risks are really very high, the returns are not going to be high enough, but there's a lot of data sitting in the MDBs that if people were given access to, there would be a basis for them to invest.
Nancy, I want to take advantage of the fact that James is back. So James, I know that you've been listening in, and I was wondering if maybe you could chime in terms of the role that you think Canada could be playing as a supportive, authentic partner of Africa.
So I think Nancy was spot on. At the end of the day, and I think some of what Stanley said also began to touch on this. It's important to keep in mind just how devastating the high cost of capital that Africans face for things like renewable energy infrastructure is for the planet. Because, we have this bizarre situation where the continent with 60% of the world's best solar, 40% of the world's best renewable energy resources, period, receives less than 2% of the world's investments in renewable energy.
And why is that? Why is that, James? Why is that not happening?
Because the biggest driver of the cost of renewable energy is the cost of capital. And because, regardless of the fact that African renewable energy is of a very high quality, if you're paying a higher interest rate on that heavily loaded upfront cost, the projects don't look as attractive as elsewhere. And let me make it very tangible what they block. I'll give a very simple example, right? So we're talking about, we talk a lot about hard to abate sectors. And this is what I'm going to try and do is show why this is a global problem. We talk about sectors of the global economy where we are really struggling to cut down emissions. One of those is the energy intensive processing of mineral resources. I'll take a simple one, bauxite. Africa exports 25% of the world, roughly 25% of the world's bauxite, most of it from Guinea, almost all of it unprocessed to other places in the world. If you look at the weighted emissions that result from that because of the energy, because bauxite plus electricity equals aluminum, if you look at all the electricity that goes into that and you weight it by the amount of emissions that are in the electricity grids of the countries that do this, you end up with about 1% of global emissions comes from this. If the only thing you changed was actually unlock a tiny proportion of the available renewable energy resources on the continent and refine that bauxite on the continent, that would entail tens of billions of dollars of investment into Africa, a reduction in the price of global aluminium, and again, 1% of global emissions gone without a single new technological innovation, without a single new major industrial process shift, without increasing the exposure to Africa, because at the end of the day, you are getting the raw material from there anyway. So it's not as if you are going to be able to avoid Africa risk as part of what you're doing. And so all of that is driven by the fact that it's just so difficult to finance this. And also the fact that we look at these projects in isolation. So we look at the supply of energy in isolation from the demand of energy or the ways that we would use it. And so we're missing out this idea, and we end up talking about this question, which is a very laudable question. How do we address the cost of capital? How do we lower how do we use data to lower the cost of capital in Africa? We treat it as if it's a challenge only for Africa, and we ignore the fact that it is costing the world the resources the world needs to decarbonize. So everyone is losing out of this, not just Africa.
Thank you, James. We're rapidly running out of time, but I did want to invite members of the audience, if you'd like to pose a question to our panelists, please do so. We have a couple of minutes. Yes, sir, over here.
Good day. My name is Tabang Bokhatu. I'm from Botswana. If anybody's looking to invest in Botswana, I have so many ideas. Please see me after. My country is not involved enough. The embassy is in Washington, D.C., and I've seen a lot of opportunities in Canada. So I told my wife I need to go out there and represent, I do have a lot of questions. The same one is sense of agency. What I've realized on the news and from this panel is that we don't realize that people are dying. Emissions are being done right in this moment. The world is being destroyed as we speak. So I believe there is a sense of agency we need to put, like I forget people's name, like the gentleman was talking that, Zambia was looking to say, well, going through trouble, it took them 2 years, something that could have taken less than 2 months. So I believe the world needs to, Canada especially, and the world, we need to put a sense of agency in what's going on.
Okay, one last point, just because
one
I want to
last
get to one other
point,
person.
I'll try to put it together. The other one is that the world has pumped a lot of money into Africa, but there is an issue of what we call corruption. What are we doing about that? Is the money going to the right people? Is the money being used rightly? How much have you put in, and are you really going to be able to develop it if we're not going to address corruption? Thank you.
Okay. Stanley, I saw you taking notes when he made that comment. Did you have something you wanted to say about that?
Just very quick one. Corruption is a big issue on the African continent, but it's not the reason not to move forward. And I don't like the fact that whenever we talk about Africa, we center it on corruption. There is corruption everywhere. It's not the only challenge why Africa is where it is, but it's a big issue, but we shouldn't center it around every African discussion.
Okay. Can I get another comment or question? Is there another? Yes.
We have a question from online. Isaac from Nairobi is asking the panel, implementing partners and civil society organizations are at the forefront in driving advocacy and action for climate change. In terms of what Canada can do, how can we build within new and existing partnerships to build up that pool of expertise on the continent on this particular issue?
Nancy and then James.
Well, I would say in general, the mindset of multilateral development banks focused very much on their own finance and their own activities has to change. So, because to mobilize the volumes of finance necessary and also to build the partnerships that are necessary is going to require a mindset where the MDBs have to figure out the best way to engage others and to bring in other people's finance. So the people thinking about MDB reform have thought a lot about this, and they've come generally to the view that what has to happen is that MDBs need to be focused on one country-owned strategy. Not just the MDBs, but private finance sources and also NGOs and also all the partners. What does not happen now is that the government determines a strategy, determines its priorities, determines the outcomes it wants to achieve, integrating climate and gender considerations, and then all of these partners collaborate and figuring out how they're going to support that strategy, and they all are going to measure success in the same way, which I think relates to corruption, because if your goal is not how much finance you push out the door, but whether you've actually achieved a common target, then you have to worry about corruption, because corruption rears its head if you aren't achieving those outcomes. So this whole notion of collaborating at one country-owned strategy is a radical notion. You wouldn't think so, but it is a radical notion, and it's the kind of thing that I think would crowd in private investors, but also nonprofits and NGOs.
James?
Yeah, I think on the theme of really crowding in private capital, and the reason that is so important is even in the best case, public finance will remain a fraction of the capital we need to attract. And so we talk about implementing partners, civil society, and so on. I think they have an important role to play. I think where I think Africans are underrepresented is in the ranks of innovators, project developers, entrepreneurs, and so on, who are actually bringing investable and bankable projects to the fore, as well as an aligned national strategy. And of course, there's always a challenge around, government is imperfect always and everywhere, and there is leakage in many places. I think there's no shortage of countries that are regarded as development stars whose economies are growing fast that are still struggling with corruption. So let's not, I think I agree with Stanley that it's not necessarily the case that the first thing that countries do is completely end corruption and then develop. It's that you tighten as you grow. And part of growing is getting more of our talent out of the pure kind of harm alleviation world, where I think a lot of talent has been attracted because there wasn't a willingness to invest in or deploy capital to African opportunities. And instead get a little bit more of that kind of more developer mindset that says, here are the innovative things we can do that make the continent and its people competitive relative to others. Make the case, in other words, for that global finance, and then tap the instruments, which of course have all of the issues that have been talked about before. But sometimes the reality is you're also not seeing that many homegrown developers of ideas really coming to the party. And so it's, development is and new investment is something that's being done to and for many parts of the continent instead of by and with the populations that need to do it, and that needs to change.
James, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up this session very, very quickly, but I would be remiss if I did not ask you this question, and I want to ask the same to Stanley. What are some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to risk and investing in Africa? What are 2 or 3 misconceptions that people, potential investors, need to be disabused of? James?
Well, I think perhaps the most pernicious one is that Africa is a country, and that there is one that there is one Africa risk profile. There is one, Lagos and Nairobi are further apart than any 2 cities in Europe, and yet you don't see the behavior of the Hungarian government affecting Great Britain's, kind of credit rating, or Canada's positioning globally being affected by what's happening in Brazil, for that matter. So there's a need to see countries in their own individual complexity and what their opportunities and dynamics are. That's one thing. We tend to paint in a very broad brush. And I think the second thing is there is a sense that what we're trying to do in Africa is bring it up to speed with the rest of the world. So what was done elsewhere 20 years ago, let's do it in Africa now, versus asking what is possible, given that the continent is not invested in some of the dead ends, such as emissions-intensive development that other parts of the world have gotten into. How would we behave if we had a chance to do over some of the investment decisions that have been made before? And that just leads to a lot of opportunities just not being visible or being missed or even being treated as challenges when they are, in fact, opportunities to build a very different and new paradigm, which I think is going to happen, but it's going to happen because Africans themselves do it, as I said before, not because it's done for them.
Yeah, thank you. Stanley?
Yeah, James covered it well. I think I can talk about what can we do differently to challenge this. One is to challenge misconceptions about Africa, and James did speak, about how what happens in one country doesn't just translate into. So there is a lot of ignorance about Africa that needs to be challenged, and I think we need to, not treat Africa as a single country, but deal with each country as it is. The opportunities are enormous, and we need to start to talk about those individual opportunities rather than sort of paint the entire continent with one brush. One other thing we need to do is to start to think about what mitigations can we put in place to reassure people, because it's not just enough to say, these are the risks, but how can we reassure people? And I think that this is where partnership with countries like Canada, where the investors come from, and working with African countries to think about how do we ensure and assure investors about the opportunities that exist. But also to also disabuse people's mind that you don't approach Africa as a short-term destination. A lot of the problems that investors that come to Africa face is sort of taking a short-term view, 2 years, 3 years. It just doesn't do well for when there are challenges and you want to exit very quickly. Long-term approach to Africa is one of the things we should encourage when people go to Africa to invest. Some of the biggest construction companies in Nigeria that I know are German companies. They have been there before I was born. Today, when others speak of risk, they are looking at you like, I've been here. I know that when you take a long-term view to doing business in Africa, it's profitable in the long run. So let's just sort of work with partner countries to say, look, short-termism is not the way forward, but taking a long-term view to invest in Africa might be, the best approach.
Short-termism is not the way forward. I think that's a good way to end this
Can I make
conversation.
just one very quick?
Okay.
Here's one simple, cost-free thing that the MDBs could do to strengthen the analysis of risk in Africa, and that is publish the data that they have had for 30 years on thousands of credit transactions that they have had in Africa, so that the private sector and everyone else knows what the actual risks are as opposed to the perceived risks. And so everybody, governments, but also other stakeholders ought to be asking the MDBs to do that.
Well, what's evident is that we need to hear more from the three of you. That session was chock full of critical information. Hopefully we can carry on this conversation. James, Nancy, Stanley, thank you so much for your contributions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So we are going to take a short break, and I'm just going to turn to my trusty, we have 5 minutes, okay. So if you can come back at 3:11, okay? If you can come back at 3:11, 5 minutes from now, all right? Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we're about ready to resume the program. So I would just ask if you could please take your seats. And just before we begin, I know that there are a number of volunteers this afternoon who are helping this program operate. So for all of you who are volunteering your time today, we certainly appreciate that. Thank you so much for being so gracious, being so welcoming. We're going to resume our program. And this session we're calling it Unlocking Development Finance in the Canadian Context. And there are two really central questions that we're trying to answer in this next hour. How can the Canadian government foster greater private sector flows towards development and climate financing in Africa? And what are the successes and limitations of innovative and blended finance? And actually, there's a third question. Is there a potential role for institutional investors like pension funds and an expanded role for FinDev? So we're going to try and address those questions in the next hour. And we've assembled once again a very strong panel, folks with lots of experience. Chris Clubb is the Managing Director for Convergence. Chris has over 20 years of experience financing development projects in more than 50 emerging and frontier markets. Chris, welcome. Please come forward. Tyler Meredith is from the Munk School of Global Affairs. Tyler is a management consultant, think tanker. Is that a noun? I haven't heard that one before, think tanker. And social economic advisor to the Prime Minister with nearly 2 decades of experience at the intersection of economics, public policy, and politics, and he can be excused for having gone to Queen's. No, it's a joke. That's a McGill joke. That's a McGill joke. Tyler, welcome.
Adrian, mea culpa, 2 Queens people.
Okay. Pranay Sampson is Director for Innovative Finance at Plan International Canada. Pranay has over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of development and finance, and currently leads the innovative finance work at Plan International Canada's new social enterprise, Plan Catalyst. Pranay, welcome. And finally, Elise Legault is the ONE Campaign Canada Director. She was previously Policy and Advocacy Manager, where she led the development of policy asks and government relations. Elise is a native of Montreal. She previously worked for several years at UNESCO, first as a researcher and writer for their Education for All Global Monitoring report in Paris, and then as the Education Finance Program Specialist. Please welcome Elise Legault. So Elise, you've just taken your seat, and I'm going to put you on the proverbial hot seat right now. And the question is this: how can we look at innovative financing within the broader context of Canada's development policy and government's intention to develop a framework of engagement within Africa?
Great. Thanks for the question. It is important to really take a bit of a broader view maybe before we delve into some of the specifics. So innovative financing is a term that I don't like very much because it can mean whatever you want it to mean in a way. But this idea of trying to get the private sector to foot more of the bill for development is not a new concept at all. And in the world of development, it got particular attention at the Financing for Development conference that happened in Addis Ababa in 2015. And this agenda was putting a lot of emphasis on trying to find resources outside of traditional ODA or development assistance. So often it was called like the billions to trillions agenda, because the idea was like you kind of mobilize billions of public money and you leverage them to get trillions in private money. So where are we 9 years later? So on the one hand, the financing gap to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, has grown. It's been worsened by the COVID crisis, of course. We have the climate crisis that's putting additional pressure on governments in Africa to invest massively in their infrastructure. And on the other hand, as we saw in the previous panel, African governments have struggled to increase their own resource mobilization, and they're facing kind of a new and very significant debt crisis because of rising interest rates. And donors have not kept their promise to support the SDGs. And ODA has not increased on par with needs. So, and that's important context, and specifically for Canada. So what happened to ODA and to international aid in Canada is that in response to big crises like the COVID crisis in Ukraine, Canada did bump its ODA since 2020. And in fact, when the 2022 data is released in a couple of weeks, we're going to see that probably we are at the highest rate of ODA to GNI, national income, in many, many years, if not decade. But this was really a bump in response to specific crises. And last year in the federal budget, there was actually a 15% reduction in the ODA budget because the government kind of went back to these pre-COVID levels, but the crisis have not subsued in any way. So that's important context. So the actual kind of core development ODA has not increased, and in fact, in Canada, the proportion going to Africa has decreased a little bit. And then the private sector money did not really materialize, or at least not with the scale of expectations that kind of came. So billions have not led to trillions. So in this context, it would be fair to express some skepticism maybe about that agenda. You could be forgiven to ask, was this kind of a diversion trick for governments not to actually, make their own, deliver on the commitments and the promises they're made? And is this innovative financing or private sector involvement kind of a magic money tree that never really becomes a reality? So it would be fair to have some skepticism. At the same time, the challenges and opportunities that have been raised in the previous panel by James, for example, really means that we should not leave any stones unturned. And this agenda was never about shifting from one sources of funding to the other. It was always about increasing the whole envelope of financing much more. So The question, I think, is really whether in Canada, if we have done the progress that we wanted to do in terms of innovative and blended finances, are there new things that we can do? So that's, I think that's the general context. And you mentioned, and it was mentioned before, this should definitely, when we look at these questions, it should really be through the lens of Canada's broader development finance policy, including traditional ODA. And also, we were talking about the kind of Canada-Africa framework of engagement or strategy that the government is working on. These questions really should be central when talking about how we engage with the African continent.
You know, Chris, your organization, Convergence Blended Finance, is a global network that generates blended finance data, intelligence, to increase private sector investment in developing countries. However, at its inception, the company was partly a Canadian initiative with what is now Global Affairs Canada as one of the founding partners, and the launch announced by then International Development Minister Christian Paradis at the 2015 Financing Development Conference in Addis Ababa. One of Convergence's roles is to monitor progress on blended finance for development and climate globally. So first of all, can you give us a quick definition? What is blended finance?
Yes, absolutely. And I really do want to thank Global Affairs Canada, Cheryl and their team, because without Global Affairs Canada, Convergence wouldn't exist, and we're trying to crystallize blended finance as a good development tool. Listen, the most important definition of blended finance, Canada and the 29 other countries called the Development Assistance Committee defined it as the strategic use of development finance to mobilize additional sources of funding to the SDGs and Paris Agreement in developing countries, broadly speaking. Okay? It's that simple. Now, that's the definition, but why is this potentially a good development tool? Big picture, let's look at the numbers. The United Nations probably does the best job of estimating the amount of investment that's required annually in the 142 low and middle income countries. Their best estimate, it's $5 trillion a year. They estimate it's actually happening around 20% of that level, so there's around a $4 trillion a year investment gap. Now let's compare that to the main sources of official development finance. The 30 rich countries, the OECD DAC members, they provide around 210 billion a year. All the multilateral development banks and all the DFIs combined provide around 130 billion of financing commitments every year. So if you just look at all the multilateral development banks and DFIs, as important as we may think they are, they provide financing commitments equal to around 2.5% of the SDG and climate investment needs in those countries. So the whole idea of blended finance is, can we smartly, can we cleverly use some of that official development assistance money and some of that MDB and DFI financing commitments in a way that we will not just marginally but substantially increase the amount of funding that's available for the 142 low and middle income countries to create the jobs and invest in the capital investment that's required to achieve the SDGs and Paris Agreement. That's it.
So just to be clear, so it's money that's intended to serve as a kind of a catalyst?
At the core of that. Now, to be very clear, right, currently, around 2% of official development assistance globally is used for this purpose. Okay, so it's very small amounts right now, right? And when you look at all the MDB and DFI financing commitments on an annual basis, around 12% of the financing commitments are used to mobilize private investment. So in general, mobilizing private investment is a secondary or tertiary activity of pretty much all of official development assistance and most MDBs and DFIs. Now, one of the biggest challenges we have, and one of the biggest benefits we have, is there's around $462 trillion of global financial assets estimated by the Financial Stability Board. That's all the amount of bonds and loans, deposits globally, 462 trillion. The problem we have, only 5% of that is in all the developing countries once we exclude China. 5% of 462 billion. The issue is trillion, sorry. The issue is that money is invested today. It's invested by the private sector, earning a return, generally speaking, in developed markets in China. We need to do a better job as a development community to get some of that money, much of that money, into the places we all know it needs to go, and that's into the 141 developing countries. but it's rationally, from their perspective, not there. Big picture for two reasons. Investors look at the risks in 141 developing countries, and whether we like it or not, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch are the biggest barometers of country risk. 76% of the 142 developing countries are rated what's known as B or lower, okay? From their perspective, that means highly speculative or substantial credit risk. It generally means that the majority of debt investment opportunities in low and middle income countries for the large majority of investors is simply not within their regulatory or fiduciary investment. I talk to a lot of investors and say, Chris, I'm sure the development impact and climate impact is great. I have no money that I can invest in that level of risk, okay? So if we want the money there, the idea of blended finance is, can we use some of this money to essentially de-risk, not the investors. No one cares about de-risking the investors. We have to de-risk their perceived investment risk of the developing countries. The benefit we have are twofold. The last decade or over 15 years, it's been around 1,000 blended finance transactions, lots of experimentation, lots of trials. We know what works effectively and efficiently. We know what delivers value added. There's lots of history there and lots of documentation. But the biggest benefit we have is the one biggest change that I've seen in the last 25 years. I've been financing projects in emerging markets. I'm going to be honest with you, it's very difficult. There's not many private investors here. Okay, that's not unusual. It's very difficult to have private investors interested in emerging markets in general, okay? The biggest benefit we have is that over the last 5 years, investors are coming into interest for what they call purpose investment, green investment, climate investment, transition investment, impact investment. So as the investors are growing their appetite and their investments there, unfortunately for us, they're achieving that mandate by investing in developed countries because the risk is acceptable and the investment asset opportunities are there. We need to create acceptable risk, i.e. fiduciary and regulatory compliant, and then create investment products for them to come. The data, the evidence is there, just unfortunately, although there's lots of dialogue in this space, there's not a lot of coordinated activity. There's no way we will mobilize billions or trillions of dollars if Canada's doing 12 million here. That's different than Belgium doing 6 million there. That's different than the Netherlands doing 3 million there. The persons that are allocating this money, because only a very small fraction of this will ever be available for this purpose. At best, 2% today. We think probably at best somewhere between 5 and 10% because we need to preserve traditional ODA for traditional purposes. But how can we cleverly and smartly, strategically allocate some of this money to really mobilize at multiples of where we are today? The investors have all looked at this. They've all sent signals, written reports in the last 2 years saying, we have the money, we want to invest, but you need to create fiduciary and regulatory compliance. Otherwise, we are simply not able to invest, okay? Now, the biggest benefit we have is that if we do this well, the interest rate savings that will accrue to the developing country, we are estimating is around $30 billion a year. We can be mobilizing a lot more private investment, lower risk. Lower risk means lower interest rates, and these developing countries will probably save around $30 billion a year if we can do this at scale, okay? So the appetite is there. The technologies are there. It's just we really need to be organizing those that can provide this funding in an organized way to allocate it to the best ideas globally, in our view.
In the previous panel, we heard, particularly from James and Stanley, that one of the biggest challenges that African countries face is getting access to affordable financing. And that really is a key roadblock to the development of African countries and to the green transition. Tyler, what in your view are some of the key things that the Canadian government could do policy-wise to generate more of this financing from all sources?
So I think Chris did an excellent job there of explaining the opportunity. And what's interesting about Canada is we sit on a lot of pension fund assets in the world. Many of our pension funds are among the top 10 biggest in the country. CPPIB alone is over $500 billion and closing in on $600 billion. That's just one pension fund. So we have a lot of money to invest. A lot of those pension funds in Canada already invest globally. They're large global investors. They're not investing, though, in the places where they could have the more significant impact for our development goals, right? They're investing in traditional developed markets, and to the extent that they're involved in emerging markets, they're doing the least risky things possible. But what's interesting, though, is even as some of those pension funds have been investing in emerging markets, they have not actually been realizing the kinds of returns that they actually could be realizing were they investing in the kind of, particularly infrastructure projects that we see in the developed, in development assistance. And I think part of the problem that we have to overcome is twofold. One is that there's a misperception of risk. So we've heard from the previous panel about the fact that there isn't sufficient data that's publicly available to benchmark some of those risks. But even to the extent that that data is available, I think there is this gulf that exists amongst amongst some of our pension funds that sees their role as being this fiduciary that can only pick what they believe to be the best return possible. And let's be honest, they actually don't always pick the best return possible, right? Like a Canadian pension fund can invest in crypto and lose a lot of money, and yet they could invest in a development infrastructure project in Gabon and actually get like 8% returns. And I should want the 8% return. And so if our investors aren't going to overcome that risk perception on their own, then there's an opportunity and a need for governments to actually, who regulate, by the way, who decide what the income tax status of a lot of these investors is, to actually think about whether we create the regulatory framework that incentivizes this. And that's where the opportunity is for government, because we need to leverage up the reach and the scale of our funding. There's no way that governments on their own are going to have the fiscal capacity to solve all these problems, as Chris has told us, right? And so we are sitting on an immense opportunity. Canadians want good returns globally, and we've got to be able to tap into that. And it requires us thinking a little bit more strategically. And last thing I'll say, Adrian, is that the risk that we face right now is actually the opposite direction. So in the last federal budget, Minister Freeland, my former boss, announced that she was interested in trying to recapture some of the funds that are going abroad through our Canadian pension funds, because they are, as I say, large international investors. Because there's a need to want to replace our own capital base here in Canada, right? And there's a very legitimate public policy objective associated with that. I would encourage that. The problem, though, is that if we swing too far in that direction, we are going to eliminate this opportunity right now for Canadian taxpayers, for Canadian pension investors, and for all of us who have exposure as future pensioners to be able to earn decent returns and do really good things in the world by doing it.
Is the problem, Tyler, a lack of knowledge, or is there inherent bias as well? Is that also maybe the elephant in the room? Is that something that we're not talking about that needs to be talked about?
So I think it is actually a little bit of both. But to be honest with you, I think a lot of these investors who are legitimately interested in some of these project opportunities, they just haven't had put in front of them some of the de-risking instruments that they would find sufficient to be able to invest, right? So project preparation is a big hurdle to be able to get certain projects ready to be able to even be considered for an investment committee. And to be honest with you, we don't have a lot of great instruments that are very good on the project preparation side of connecting into those available opportunities that exist for potential future investors. So we can develop projects, we can see where they exist in particular countries, but connecting them to investors is where we often lose things.
And just to deepen this a little bit more, do we have enough people who understand the African continent within these organizations?
So I would argue no, necessarily, but I feel probably there are others who can speak to that better than I.
Yeah, okay. Pranay, what does innovative finance mean to you, and what role can it play in Africa's green transformation and Canada's development finance strategy?
I'm still struck by a lot of what Chris described as the challenge that we face, because, and when you framed it, at least really, when we're talking about innovative finance, what the innovation is rethinking parts of what Chris talked about. Because if we think about it in those terms, it's a dire future. We have set up a system that needs to be rethought. We're talking about using the same system as it is currently defined. We also need to think about what needs to change in that system. So it's a two-pronged approach. And let me sort of give you, I think, for each of the stakeholders that we sort of touched upon in the Canadian landscape, I'm new to the Canadian landscape, so I come with sort of a fresh lens and a fresh perspective. I would say there's three groups that we've broadly touched on. We have the long-term institutional investors. What they need is long-term stable investments. So long-term stable investments, globally, we're struggling. We are in the midst of a climate crisis, perma-crisis. I mean, we see it day after day after day. Structurally, we will always consider these to be high risk, and it will get worse. When I speak to my country office colleagues all over the African continent, it is cycles of drought and flood, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And unfortunately, we're going to end up in debt traps, which we see at a micro level, but we also see at a country level. At a micro level, you have the cost of borrowing for a woman in Zimbabwe who has an incredible track record of repayment at over 70% because of that bankruptcy that we were talking about. So at the end of the day, who's really paying that cost is the woman who is borrowing in a joint liability group. There's been a lot of innovation in the financial community, and that's the second community. There is permission to innovate in the financial sector, but not for development purposes. It is for a profit motive. It is for a profit purpose. We've seen incredible innovations on investment banking. It hasn't yet translated to development purposes. So there is a translation gap in that innovation space. There is a question of data. There's also a question of culture. It's a question of localization. We have a discussion in the development community around localization. What does it mean? And why do we not have similar conversations in the context of finance? The challenge is, as Chris very correctly pointed out, is how we've defined fiduciary. When we talk about fiduciary duty, we have inherited a way of looking at fiduciary duty. There is some work to redefine what that means. And that is in terms of thinking of what is a good future. And that, for me, I think is really what this comes down to, is thinking through what is the future that we want and how do we invest. Finance can be so creative. Let's imagine a future 20 to 25 years from now. Let's imagine a better future. What does it mean to innovate in the way that we finance? And therefore, that comes to our third stakeholder, which is government. And Canada has done an incredible job of investing in its civil society organizations. It's an incredibly powerful sector. That's one of the reasons why I'm part of it, because of how much of a voice it has. It's the first time that I've been out of the financing community and really into civil society, because this is the opportunity to bring some of those conversations forward. That's the sense of hope I want to have in this community, is to say there is sparks and shoots, and Convergence has examples of this, of these stakeholders coming together for this common purpose. But the common purpose has to be saying we have to try both strategies. We can't just try using the system as it currently is, because that's going to lead us down a very specific path. We also have to identify opportunities to change the system, because there are massive gaps in how the system currently operates.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, as Pranay was speaking, I noticed that you were nodding your head constantly. Tell us what you agreed with.
Well, I think particularly the need to redefine what fiduciary obligation means, right? And this is something that governments actually control, because again, back to in the particular Canadian context where we have large pension fund investors, and they're not the only form of institutional investor that exists, but they are amongst the largest in Canada, certainly.
Sorry, Tyler, for those people who don't know that term fiduciary, what does it mean?
It basically means that you have an obligation as the investor on behalf of in the context, let's take pensions as an example, on behalf of future pensioners who are going to require a certain cash flow associated with that benefit that's going to be paid later, that you are making the best investment that you can in order to generate that future as high a return in the future for them, right? And so that you have an obligation to consider effectively what the highest return is that you could achieve at the relative risk that you would take on for that return, right? And so all I'm saying is what underlies that definition of fiduciary and how a fiduciary assumes the obligation of risk is ultimately what they consider to be the risk, right? And so there are questions about whether climate change is a risk that is actively incorporated into climate mitigation, is actively incorporated into the way in which we assess future risks that we as investors in the future may also have to take on, and how that will affect our ability to invest. Those are just that's just one example of how the models in which we try to assess that risk is not hasn't necessarily caught up with perhaps all of the actual risks that we deal with today. But my point being, if we believe that there is a way to generate very stable long-term returns, which there is, right? There's lots of projects that have been invested in over the course of many decades that have very low default risk, that generate consistent, stable cash flows, and actually operate, in some cases, with very minimal political risk, despite what we may think about certain regimes in certain parts of the world. And so given that, this actually should be, as Chris was saying, actually potentially rated as projects at a much higher grade than they are often given credit for by credit rating agencies. So there's two ways to do that. You can either regulate the way in which we assess the risk on the part of credit rating agencies, or you can change the way we assess the risk at the fiduciary level.
Elise, what are some concrete things that the Canadian government could be doing to encourage private sector flows towards development and climate financing in Africa?
So I think that, I mean, there's lots of different things, but it's good to look at the institutions that we do have, and one of the main ways that governments can do that, leverage private sector money, is through their own bilateral development finance institutions, or DFI, another acronym for everybody. So of course, here in Canada we have FinDev, which is actually the newest of the DFIs, because Canada was the last country among G7 countries to have a bilateral DFI. And in some ways, they play a similar roles kind of bilaterally than the MDBs that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So there's definitely potential for growth there. So like in 2020, FinDev was 0.2% of all G7 DF5 portfolio size, and while we're 4.2% of total G7 GDP. So of course, that figure might grow because there was a new capitalization of FinDev through the Indo-Pacific strategy that was announced recently. But and there's a significant portion that goes to Africa, around 40%. So there's definitely a potential for growth there. Just even proportionally, our DFI is still, a fairly small fish. So there's potential there. But even so, we have to assess the performance of FinDev first. And I feel that as one, we're an advocacy organization, and we like to talk about things publicly and make things known. And it is striking to me that I feel within the development community, FinDev is not really well known. It feels to me, and I don't know how well known it is, what it does even within the Canadian government. So there's some great things have been achieved by FinDev. For example, there was a challenge around women businesses and entrepreneurs that was launched at the last Canada G7 actually in 2018, which was called the 2X Challenge. And the goal was to mobilize money for women-led businesses, among others. And they surpassed their goal like massively. They were aiming to raise $3 billion, and they I think they're at like $27 billion raised, including some significant private investment. I feel that nobody really knows about this, and that's like a really good Canadian achievement. But there's also needs to be accountability. At another G7 in 2021, G7 development finance institutions, including FinDev, made a commitment to invest $80 billion in African businesses over the next 5 years. And I'm not really sure what that goal is. I don't know if it's known. There's a question about like what's FinDev's fair share in this? Like, is this something that could be recommitted to as part of the Canada-Africa strategy? I think these are things to look at, like things that like that Canada is already committed to, but that more could be done. So that's one avenue, looking at the institutions that we do have.
Chris, I know that you have some ideas about FinDev. We were kind of chatting about it beforehand, and you were suggesting that there's certain kind of structural issues within government that militate against the development, shall I say, or the effectiveness, rather, of FinDev. Can you maybe just give us your own assessment of FinDev to this point?
Well, I think I'm a very pragmatic person, practical person. I would love, for investors to change how they allocate their capital. the reality is I don't really see that happening, and certainly in my lifetime. Therefore, how do we create investments that actually meet their obligations, from my perspective? So, so for FinDev, I think FinDev's a wonderful organization. If I've looked at its business plan, it's projecting to actually be allocating around $275 million a year. Okay, that's equal to 0.2% of all the MDB and DFI financing commitments. Okay, so in general, FinDev will not be a big player out there. Unless, of course, the capitalizations are going to go up dramatically. But even if it went up 4 times, we're only talking about 1% of all MDB and DFI. So what I would suggest, because it's a new entity, is the Canadian government should govern FinDev to say, okay, what do we want the MDB and DFI environment to look like 5 years from now? And how am I going to govern FinDev to lead the way? Okay? That's what I would do. And, there's lots of things we could do there, but certainly if you're going to be allocating $275 million a year, and you're going to be allocating it similar to how all the other MDBs and DFIs are, how much of a difference can you possibly make? So I would say, what do we want the MDB and DFI community to look like 5 years from now, and how can Canada lead getting us there? From my perspective, financial additionality, we're talking about debt sustainability. 90% of MDB and DFI commitments are hard currency debt obligations. We are, by definition, MDB and DFI financing really threatens debt sustainability in many developing countries. If that's the case, how do we reverse that and get a higher level of financing commitments that are not hard currency debt obligations, as an example? So if I had a small organization like FinDev Canada, I'd say, what do we want the MDB and DFI community to look like? I'd govern them to be a leader to get us there.
Mm-hmm. Pranay, you began by describing yourself as a rank outsider, as someone who's new, relatively new to the scene. What's the best kind of free advice that you would give to the Canadian government when it comes to trying to encourage private sector investment?
I want to make sure that we sort of capture the challenge at some level, because if we do create products, and I was part of an organization that listed an instrument on the Singapore Exchange called the Women's Livelihood Bond. It was one of the first blended finance products, and brought in a new generation of investors to the market. Was very strong on outcomes in terms of the outcomes that were reported, and also generated returns. So it's become a model which has grown from 8 million in the first issuance to 12 million, to 20 million, to 50 million, to 100 million. There's scalability. It comes, and you can see the pathway. The challenge, and this is sort of reflecting on my own journey, is it isn't enough. We need multiple avenues at the same time. It's a both-and situation, that it is not just about how we invest in one specific way, which is this type of pathway that I described, with an instrument that investors understand, because you're designing it for investors as they currently understand it. There also needs to be a transformation in terms of how we understand risk, and that actually there is...
What does that mean, a transformation in how we understand risk?
So currently, and this is, I'm going to be a little bit technical in terms of the Canadian government and how it works. There's very specific instruments in which the way that the Canadian government allocates money. It has a pocket of money which is grant-oriented. It's called contribution agreements, contributions, and then you have, on the other hand, unconditionally repayable contributions is essentially debt. It is a loan. That has to be repaid. And that is viewed with extreme risk aversion, because that is held to the highest standard of saying you have to have a track record and then we will invest in you. One of the challenges with the Innovative Finance Program that was launched in Canada, it was launched with very big ambition of taking on risk, but with the wrong instrument. So that the problem with innovative finance is the devil is in the details. We have to know the details of all of this, and it's very hard. The financial community isn't naturally transparent. Chris knows this as well. A number of the transactions, it isn't actually reported how much returns are being made, and that's part of the challenge in this space, is actually benchmarking what is an effective risk return. We've also had Nancy explain that the MDBs aren't releasing their data either. So we are dealing with a community that has a very traditional way of working, which is extremely opaque. A pension fund will not tell you where you're getting your money put right now. There is no way that you get to influence at this stage where the pension fund decides what is best in terms of their interpretation of their fiduciary duty to you as a pensioner, as a future pensioner. So it's sort of redefining a number of these parameters, because the way that we are currently investing, we are often creating externalities that are creating additional risk for us longer term in the way that we invest. For example, the overexposure to long-term Canadian real estate assets. And that is part of the challenge that Canada faces in terms of affordability, is actually of our own making at some level. And it's easier from a political perspective often to blame outsiders. Also, where I come from is just sort of from this very outsider perspective, and it's not, it's from a very social justice perspective. We have not created the problems that are being blamed, and this is true of climate change in particular. A lot of the punishment of this high cost of capital is linked to the climate crisis, which has not been created by the countries that are bearing the largest burden of that. There's a very interesting initiative, which I would encourage all of you to look up. The Bridgetown Initiative, it's sort of a reframing of what the climate crisis will do for small island developing states. If you imagine a small country, it will never be investable from a traditional view of finance. A small island country will just continue to have increased extreme climate events in the future. So its cost of finance is going to go up and up and up. And that's true even in the African continent. So it is really for us to think about how we structurally change some of these metrics. And if our metric is only how much money has moved, I think that's the biggest challenge. We continually talk about the SDG funding gap with the funding gap as a metric of money moved. We have to shift it, and this is where potentially there's a role for the Canadian ecosystem. We have, within the Canadian ecosystem, developed metrics around gender transformative impact. And we have developed a certain skill set in tracking and reporting impact, which can actually be linked to lower risk in the long term. But we need to pilot, and IIP was a brilliant pilot, in terms of what we can do in terms of actually shifting some of those risk metrics, but actually taking on more risk deliberately with the pathway to that better future in mind, and actually take on that risk. And that's the role of government, is to sort of bring in much more of that risk appetite. So not a URC, but actually closer to a grant, but to take on that type of risk.
I want to go to the audience, but Chris, you looked like you had something you wanted to say.
I would say this, from my perspective, in taking on more risk, yes, I think a portion of the Canadian government's funding, whether it's through FinDev or directly from Global Affairs Canada, and only a portion of this needs to be oriented around, the reality is we have a $4 trillion investment gap out there. We really need to increase the supply of capital to these projects to get people employed and get the capital investment actually made, okay? The cost of capital, generally speaking, will only go down unless you forcefully subsidize it, which has been demonstrated many times over the world not to work, or you create enough competition so it'll go down. We need to really have kind of a Marshall Plan to get financial intermediation in Africa bigger, stronger, in a better position, and through that, the actual cost of capital will go down. But right now, as we sit here, sadly, there is no plan whatsoever in the development community to strengthen domestic financial intermediation in Africa. It's a random walk by different MDBs and DFIs, which is probably the biggest missed opportunity that we actually have. What can we collectively do to make domestic financial institutions in Africa have more capitalization, be in a stronger position, and ultimately provide the local currency financing that these businesses need versus the hard currency financing that jeopardizes debt sustainability?
We know that the Marshall Plan saved Europe, right? It produced the modern world, modern Europe. What would a Marshall Plan that you were imagining do for Africa? And what would it look like? What would it consist of?
When it comes to Africa from a big development perspective, I think there's really two things we need to focus on. Creating jobs. The IMF and the African Development Bank says 90% of jobs created in Africa in the next 30 years are going to be created by the private sector. The private sector, medium-sized enterprises, small-sized enterprises, entrepreneurs, they need funding from domestic financial institutions, okay? We are sadly almost nowhere in the formal development finance community to really create the strong domestic financial intermediation that Africa needs. The second thing is Africa needs a hell of a lot more electricity being produced over the next 30 years, and we need as much of that as possible to be in renewable energy. So those are the two things that I would really focus on. The benefit we have is that, blended finance is one of the tools in the toolbox we have. It has done an excellent job of getting financing into the hands of SMEs and businesses so they can create jobs.
SMEs?
Small and medium-sized enterprise. I'll give you an example. Financial institutions, if we want to mobilize private investors, they need to understand the risk they're taking. You know what? They understand providing capital and financing to banks, to microfinance institutions, to pension funds, fintech companies, all those institutions that would provide the financing to the small and medium-sized enterprises that will create the jobs. Businesses, private sector does that every single day in developed countries. So what's our plan to get that money out of developed countries into developing countries, into the exact sectors and institutions that they understand exceptionally well? Unfortunately, we don't have a plan in the development community. Same thing with the renewable energy. The private sector really understands electricity generation and renewable energy, and what's our plan to create a fiduciary investment opportunity. There are lots of good examples of what can be done in the blended finance community and in the development finance community, but in general, we don't have a plan in either of those two areas.
Okay. I want to go to our audience, and sir, you've been very patient, so if you could just introduce yourself, and then you can pose your question.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kerry Max, and I have the privilege of being able to work for Global Affairs Canada on, I think, a very interesting program that Pranay's institution is a part of, organization is a part of, Partnering for Climate. And the reason I'm mentioning this is in the earlier session, there was a call for the Government of Canada to support NGOs, both in Canada and in Africa, in addressing their own challenges and really increasing their own capacities. It's linked to the localization agenda, where there's a real push for money and decision-making to get onto the ground through donor aid. The question I've got for the panelists is, what role, in a conversation that is primarily about hitting those huge economies of scale and dealing with those huge projects and opportunities, what role is there for innovative finance at the retail level, on the ground, helping women, families, youth deal with their challenges? And I mention this because, again, Partnering for Climate has provided partners like Plan Canada, who is partnering with an organization out of British Columbia, Cascadia Seaweed, a private sector company that under other circumstances would have loved to co-invest, but because we were using grant finance, could not. What role could things like this do to help address that missing middle and that basically missing bottom of development finance on the ground? And Pranay, just one point there. We do have unconditionally repayable contributions. We do have grants and contributions, but we also have conditionally repayable contributions. And these are being executed right now through Global Affairs Canada. They are grants that are repaid if certain conditions are triggered, and they allow for a lot more risk sharing. So I'm just wondering what role you may see for instruments like those. Thank you.
Pranay, you're chomping at the bit. So Pranay and then Elise.
Thank you, Kerry, and appreciate you bringing up the Coastal Resilience Program in Kenya. It's really, I think for us, such an important model, but I think it also gives, and Kerry briefly touched on it, one of the things that the Government of Canada also does is it signals to the market what's important. And this is true also for the pension funds. This is what is, when you think about the concept of what is material in terms of investment, the way that market actors can use their power is what we would call market signaling or double materiality. So you signal to the market that you want the market to move in a particular direction. So this is when we're saying imagine a better future. The important part is to say, when we think about double materiality, how do we indicate that we want the market to move in a specific direction? Because otherwise, we're just going to be chasing, the best return project in a market that we know and understand better. So the market signaling, unfortunately, in one of the climate proposals was to say, do not use innovative finance. And that's a very challenging thing because actually the types of programs that we're talking about, we can actually use it. So there's some flexibility that needs to be built into the grant agreements. And the CRC pilot, which has now grown into a CRC program, is a brilliant way of sort of coming somewhere in between. I think a lot more innovation in those types of risk-taking abilities and encouraging civil society in Canada, I'm also co-chair of the Innovative Finance Working Group of Cooperation Canada. So we have about 80 civil society members that participate on a regular basis and come together to ideate and to learn together, because in the spirit of cooperation, we understand that we all have a lot to learn in this space as we're thinking about changing the system. To give you another example, we all run, as international NGOs, a large number of us run village loans and savings groups. We have over 1.5 million women members who are borrowing and saving consistently, and we have that kind of data. We, as civil society, haven't made the effort to make that data available and to leverage that asset. Just Plan alone, we have over 80,000 village loans and savings groups. And it's the same with CARE, it's the same with World Vision. We have a number of the large INGOs that should and could be leveraged. And the partnerships with the private sector, I think one of the things that the Government of Canada can indicate is for us to be much more innovative in how we approach impact, because we have a lot of the other tools. We have the impact measurement capability, and the difference when you invest in someone's future as opposed to have them participate in a program which then shuts down, it's completely a different paradigm shift. And that's the kind of innovation we need within the Canadian ecosystem.
Elise?
Actually, I think Renee answered that very well, so I'll let others in the audience have other questions.
Yeah, Chris?
I might ask Kerry's question. You know, when you look at the multilateral development banks and DFIs, and let's say support for the end beneficiaries you want, you know, small entrepreneurs, small businesses, okay, you'd be depressed how little of MDB and DFI capital supports that community, okay? The one product they have largely, they'll knock on the door of a commercial bank, say, here's a US dollar loan, you take it from me, you take the risk of lend to them, and I'll see you next week when my interest is, broadly speaking. The amount of equity that the MDB and DFI system has put in to African banks and non-banks is close to zero. The amount of risk sharing that they bear on the end portfolios is close to zero. One good innovation, it's a blended finance vehicle, it's Africa Guarantee Fund. It was set up to help that problem. Hey bank, please go lend money to these underserviced businesses, and we'll bear half the risk with you, okay? That's an outlier, that's a unicorn, unfortunately. So really, to get there, I think in general, the MDB and DFI system isn't set up to solve that problem. Therefore, who are the others who can solve that problem, like the Africa Guarantee Fund, and channeling your money there? Unfortunately, 70% of concessional money from donors flows through the MDBs and DFIs. They use it for good development impact and climate impact. They do not use it to take on these level of risks, nor to mobilize. So
what's
good development
concessional
impact.
money? What does that mean?
I'm sorry. So development finance comes in two forms. Here's a loan from IFC. I'm making you this loan at a very similar term to a Kenyan bank would or Citibank would. Okay, it's what we call non-concessional. Organizations like Global Affairs Canada come along and say, we're prepared to do something on non-market terms. We're either prepared to lose all the money, lose some of the money, but we're certainly taking on a risk and a return that is below market. And we generally call that non-concessional. So 70% of the non-concessional money from the public sector goes to the MDBs and DFIs who do not use it for mobilizing private investment right now.
Okay.
We actually have a question online that's a helpful segue from that. We've been talking about this issue in macro level. Does the panel have an example of a tangible blended finance project? What was the result? What did it bring for Canada? What were the terms? Can you bring this down to earth for us?
Yeah, Chris. And then Elise.
Yeah, I can certainly, I better have some, okay, where I sit. You know, one that I'll give you, so this Friday at the London Stock Exchange, okay, a brilliant blended finance vehicle is going to be announced, okay. As I mentioned earlier, investors look at low and middle income countries and they see a risk profile that it's not that they don't want to invest, they cannot invest. It's beyond their fiduciary and regulatory obligations. We might want to change the regulatory and fiduciary obligations, but we are there now. So the new entity is being created this Friday. It's called the Green Guarantee Company. It is going to Fitch. It's getting a BBB rating. And it is telling all investors, we're prepared to provide a guarantee to you if you lend money to a climate-friendly project. You don't have to worry about the project risk because we're going to assess it, and if we like it, we'll give you a BBB guarantee. And a BBB guarantee means investment grade, okay? Which means generally, every investor in the world can now invest in that project because they're going to be benefiting from a BBB guarantee. That was only possible because really two things. Canada and others supported at the Green Climate Fund, capital going into the Green Climate Fund, and also the UK government in a program called Mobilist. Okay, so that's a brilliant blended finance vehicle that will be announced this Friday at the London Stock Exchange. We think that that is probably one of the 10 archetypes or solutions that really need to be replicated, because really the funders of this vehicle are largely going to be the donor community, delivering to debt investors what they need in investment grade, and the money is going to be flowing into the projects that we need funded, climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects in Africa.
I did want to call on one person from our audience, Robert Chaberiak, who is the Managing Director of Investment for Desjardins International Development, to weigh in on the conversation. I know that you had a number of things that you wanted to.
I guess I can offer, well, I'm fund manager, but also representing a development organization attached to the Desjardins Group out of Quebec. And so I guess kind of 3 observations and then kind of a question/challenge to the panelists. First off, I guess it's supposed to be development oriented. So although I'm a fund manager, I have to kind of go a bit wider than my normal remit. But if we're looking for development, I think fundamentally we need to change the language about what metrics are being looked at, because the whole conversation today has been basically about a rate of return. And if you're looking at development, and even in this development-oriented forum, we never got past what a rate of return for investment. And there's a lot of ways of measuring a result from an investment besides an internal rate of return or an interest rate. And that, sadly, was completely lacking from the conversation. Second, you have to go to the point of, on the other side of the spectrum, risk. Everyone talks with lots of platitudes, studies, conferences, papers. We want to get money to people that don't get money. And then you go to them with an investment proposal, whether it be in Canada, and I don't want to say I'm not going to give a blessing or a damning to any particular organization, but you mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa for an investment. Every Canadian organization in the public sector, semi-public, everywhere, will tell you that's far too risky. We can't do it. And this is the government with their innovative programs, FinDev with their backstop from the government, and GAC and stuff. They won't invest. They'll give you a loan, which will be non-concessional largely, or a slight concession, or with a government wrapper from a World Bank or some equivalent institution. You ask for risk capital, someone that's going to, provide concessional or risk capital to an investment. It does not exist in Canada. And then the third area is, although we have lots of good people doing lots of work and studies, they talk amongst themselves forever. And nobody knows who's responsible for what. So we have programs, but then they look and say, well, that's not my role, it's theirs. And they go, well, that's not our role, it's theirs. And so all the money that they're sitting on never even gets distributed. And year after year it goes on with more studies and talk, but the money doesn't go out the door. And so there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of appreciation for accepting risk and trying to do something with it besides saying it's too much. And it's far beyond fiduciary responsibilities. It's the way the whole thing is perceived. And then there's the whole area on the other side about, well, what do you want for development? Is it only an interest rate and a rate of return? If so, you're going to be stuck.
So what would you do to change things?
Well, I think you need someone to take some leadership, someone to clear up the roles and responsibilities, and someone to start doing something instead of talking and waiting for another study, another conference, another announcement from a politician somewhere. And then, like they've mentioned a number of times, $100 billion was supposed to be for Africa infrastructure. That was supposed to be 2 or 3 years. Nothing happened. I think Macron came out a little while ago and said they think they're going to hit the target by 2023. They think. But that's about 3 or 4 years later than planned, and that's still a drop in the bucket. It's only the first $100 billion that was announced, and nothing else has really happened since. So it's a question of a system that spends a lot of time talking amongst itself or amongst the players, but not really actually getting into action. And I think and so my question would be, as representatives, to the extent you feel that you've got the remit to do that, who in Canada is going to take leadership and when?
I'm going to ask Tyler if maybe he can weigh in on this.
Tyler,
I wonder why I'm being put on the spot on this one. So look, I think at its core, because I agree with your diagnostic in the sense that there is a sense of understanding the problem, admiring the problem, making a commitment to solve the problem, and then the follow-through is the challenge. Now, to be honest, we have made some progress in the last number of years. FinDev creation, I think, is a very important stepping stone, especially in the Canadian context, where we have institutional investors that we can partner with. I think the challenge, though, as it exists more broadly around development issues, is that the Canadian public, to be very honest, is tuned out. And if the Canadian public is tuned out, our politicians are probably going to be tuned out. And if our politicians are being tuned out, there is just an institutional bias to not, whether it's, especially if we're talking about, as Chris has discussed, the need to basically create a series of guarantee products, whether they're supported by sovereigns or MDBs or what have you, that the complex work that's required to do that and to get the commitment potentially even of governments to try something different is not going to be there if the public itself isn't demanding or seeing an obvious payback to doing development, right? And this is what is so wrong, for example, about how we in this country talk about, for example, climate change. There's a huge opportunity globally to reduce emissions if we leverage how we want to invest globally around climate adaptation and climate mitigation projects. Except we've adopted a stance in Canada that says we have to solve our entire commitment as Canadians simply by doing domestic-oriented activity, as opposed to saying we also have technology, capital, resources, opportunity that we can export and partner with the developing world in order to be able to do these things in collaboration, where there are huge opportunities to do climate abatement, emissions abatement and emissions reduction. So I would just, I think part of what we have to do to get at the institutional inertia that you just described is to actually change the way in which we talk about development. Now, that's beyond the remit of this conference, obviously, but that is at the heart of a lot of the public policy problems that we're facing on this issue.
I think Robert was also saying that you feel that there's been too much stress on this rate of return in terms of investment, that we're looking at this in a very kind of narrow way. Yeah, so I'm going to ask, how would you respond to that charge, and what's another way of looking at the investment?
Well, certainly, when I talk about a blended finance transaction, right, the price of admission to get a private investor, you need to give them a market-based risk return. Otherwise, they cannot invest and will not invest, okay? The benefit we have is that everybody who's allocating public sector funding to this whole space is FinDev Canada, is IFC, is Global Affairs Canada. They cannot allocate a penny of money without it passing a development impact or climate impact test, okay? So all blended finance transactions that have public sector participants definitely has really, really strong development or climate impact associated with it, because they have that process. The benefit we have, how can we draw this fiduciary, regulatory compliant investment to quote unquote impact investment? Because they're not impact experts. Cheryl and her colleagues are impact experts. They've been doing this for 30, 40 years. How can we take that core competence and their fiduciary and regulatory compliant, bring it together and create impact investment in developing countries? Because impact investment, when you hear that, that is going to developed countries today. Very little of that is going to developing countries. How do we create impact investment flows in developing countries? We have to give them market equivalent risk-adjusted returns. If not, they will not and cannot come. So that's the only time I use that. It's not because development impact and climate impact is there when the public sector is mandated to achieve those objectives.
Elise, probably final word to you. I'm getting the sign that we have to wrap up.
For sure. No, I know we have to wrap up. I just kind of want to piggyback on this notion of leadership that you were just talking about, Robert. And we've been talking about the notion of risk, real of perceived, is really at the core of a lot of discussions around how to support African countries achieve their development goals and the green transition. So it would be important for the government to show leadership and send kind of a signal. And going back to this Canada-Africa framework for engagement or strategy and so forth, we really hope that this can be comprehensive and ambitious because a lot of countries, regions are taking notice that Africa is the future, that it has a bulging youth population, lots of green potential. And if Canada's not at the table, we're going to miss these opportunities. I mean, just this week there was an Italy Africa summit. I mean, these things are happening on a weekly basis right now. So Canada does need to be at the table there. And just even, there's a lot of technical discussions about the instruments and things like that that we need to work on, and these are important. But just like this, the signal that could be sent if like the Canadian government at the highest levels of leadership, if like the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister kind of like stepped in and said, this is important and this Canada-Africa strategy is equally as important as the Indo-Pacific one, I think it could send a message to private investors in Canada that this is worth investing, and actually that this is not just a charity thing, and that the risk is not as big. So this signaling from the highest political level, I think, is will be important as well.
I think that's an appropriate way to end this session. Thank you all so much for your contributions over the last hour. And I'd like to turn the microphone over to Minerva Sadler-Gray.
Another round of applause for our panelists. Your Excellencies, diplomatic representatives, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the conclusion of this insightful and fruitful conversation. We've had you here for a long time this afternoon, but we're so appreciative of your attention, of your engagement, and for your interest in this issue. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Minerva Sadler-Gray. I lead partnerships for the ONE Campaign here in Canada. On behalf of the ONE Campaign, I extend my gratitude to all of you present and those of you joining us online as well for taking the time to participate and engage in this conversation today. I also want to express thanks and appreciation to Mr. Sharif and the Aga Khan Foundation Canada. Thank you so much for just your tremendous partnership in bringing this to fruition. We have enjoyed the hospitality that you've extended to us today. And special thanks to Adrian, our moderator, who skillfully facilitated this conversation, your ongoing involvement with the ONE Campaign, and your support in helping us to amplify these issues is valued. Thank you so much. To our esteemed panelists, Nancy had to run off to the airport to catch a flight back to DC, but please accept our immense gratitude. The themes discussed today are intricate and challenging. However, the insightful and lively conversation you provided has elevated our understanding, I believe, I hope, of the central importance of the evolution of multilateral development banks and the way innovative finance, blended finance, can bridge the development financing gap. But as Chris pointed out, we need a plan. And so I hope that we can work on that together moving forward. There is a nimble group of people that made this day possible and special. Elise, our ONE Canada director, who was part of the panel a while ago. Justin, our associate director. Neha, she's in the room somewhere, who leads our government relations work. Rilette, everything this woman does, hold our team together. And Vicky, our operations director. And Sophia, the senior manager, and Uju, the event officer here at Aga Khan Foundation. Your rock star quality is matchless in putting this together. Thank you all so much. I also want to acknowledge one of our board members, Mark Entwistle. Thank you so much for your steadfast support of the work that we do, and we appreciate you. I had a few key messages that I pulled from the panel conversations, but in the interest of time, we will share those out with you following this event. We've been facing one global crisis after the next over the last 2 years, all of which deserve our attention and urgent action. However, so does Africa. All of you coming out and joining this conversation today are participating in placing some of the spotlight back onto Africa, as African countries have been missing from the news headlines. The work we relentlessly engage in at the ONE Campaign, and truly all of you in your respective spaces, is not just about today, but also about our future. As you've heard many times today, Africa has enormous potential and opportunities not only for the benefit of Africans, but for the world and global economy. Africa is the fastest growing continent, and by the end of the century, it will represent about 40% of the global population. Notably, its population is younger and faster growing than any other regions. However, for Africa and the world to experience the benefits of these opportunities, Africa needs access to affordable financing. There are two things our team have been thinking about, two pivotal opportunities for Canada to make a substantial impact this year. You heard it mentioned before, making multilateral development banks bigger, better, and more effective. Presently, and my colleague Stanley mentioned this as well, African countries face significantly higher borrowing costs, paying 5 times more to borrow from capital markets than they would if Canada and other MDB shareholders delivered on reforms and increased their financial contributions. Later is too late. This year, 2024, we need to see those reforms come to fruition, and Canada must push for ambition, speed, and agility. Because African countries and emerging markets need institutions to be responsive now with urgency to their needs. 2024 is also a replenishment year for the World Bank, and donors like Canada should counter the trend of diminishing contributions and reaffirm their commitment. Second, my colleague Elise mentioned this as well, there is a pressing need for a comprehensive and ambitious Canada-Africa strategy that integrates development, trade, and diplomacy comparable to the Indo-Pacific strategy. This means the allocation of additional financing resources. We need financing. It's really the bottom line. At ONE Campaign, we remain relentless in our efforts to advance these issues. We know that we need to mobilize trillions in low-cost capital to unlock Africa's green potential, and in doing so, transform African economies. Notably, our efforts have yielded success in shaping the G20's expert group report on multilateral development banks released last July. This report incorporates our recommendation to triple financing by 2030, underlining our influence in driving significant policy advancements. This is hard, but necessary work, and it requires us to work together to get it done. And so partnerships, particularly reciprocal partnerships, stand as the central element of our work at the ONE Campaign and a key component of our theory of change. I extend an invitation to those of you who are eager to further this conversation and to collaborate on these issues. Please feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues that are in this room. So again, many thanks to the Aga Khan Foundation and to those staff who are working behind the scenes, the volunteers, the technicians who brought this life to us. Thank you so much for your hard work, and thank you to all of you and those online for having been with us today. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minerva, for those closing remarks. I know we've had a very long and fruitful conversation today, but just before we head out, we want to make sure that we take some time to, pause and reflect on, all that we've heard. So quite quickly, you will see on your screen a QR code to a Slido link. So please feel free to bring out your phone. And if you're also joining us virtually, you can use another device. So just go to slido.com and then use the code that you see right there on your screen. We just want to take some time to, intentionally reflect on the conversation that we've had today, and I think we can move on into the question. So specifically, we're saying that as we're reflecting on this event, what commitments or personal takeaways do you have from today's dialogue? So please feel free to, take a second and, jot down some thoughts. just as we share with one another, what commitments or personal takeaways that we're, having from today's dialogue. So it's not just that we're coming and having these conversations and leaving, but then we're also taking note of what it is that we're taking forward with us as we leave either the virtual space or the space here at the delegation. So I see a few comments on climate action, thinking about investment criteria and development finance, delivering local finance and support building markets for SDGs and climate goals. And we'll just pause a little bit to take a few more responses as they come in. The need for Canada to reassert its commitments to development and take leadership, and so much more are coming in. So please feel free to take the time, to also think about what you're taking away from today's conversation. And then quite quickly, before we wrap up officially today's event, we want to hear from you. We'd love to get your feedback about today's session. So I think we can move over to the slide that will have the QR code for you to give us a response about how today's session went. If you're in the room, actually outside of this space, there will be a little flyer on one of the tables where you can also find the link to give your feedback about the event. And the code will come up on the screen shortly as I wrap up. And then lastly, from us here at AKFC, we'd like to also let you know that next week, as we're marking International Development Week here in Canada, we are putting on an event on February 5th, and the event will be taking place in the evening from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. So if you've not already registered, if you want to get more details, please feel free to speak to me or speak to any one of the AKFC colleagues that are here in the room. Once again, thank you so much, and we have some refreshments for those who are joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening.